From paper to printing to gunpowder. What if the world owes it all to China? Not just the noodles and fireworks kind of China you read about in 5th grade. We're talking about a civilization that cracked the code on innovation centuries before the West even looked up from the Dark Ages. While Europe was busy chasing dragons and debating flat Earth theories, China was inventing compasses, seismographs, suspension bridges, and revolutionizing warfare and communication. But here's the twist. Somewhere along the way, the credit wandered. Ideas got passed along trade routes, renamed, repackaged, and boom, suddenly it's the Age of Enlightenment in Europe and everyone's acting like they just invented civilization. So today, we're diving into how ancient China invented everything first and why history doesn't always give credit where it's due. Buckle up. How ancient China invented everything first and the West took credit. 1. Paper. Before the invention of paper, people in ancient China had to get pretty creative with what they used to write on. And let's just say the options weren't ideal. Bamboo strips were one of the main materials, but they were heavy, clunky, and difficult to manage. Imagine trying to carry an entire book or a to-do list written on long wooden slats strapped together like a scroll. Silk was another option, much more elegant and smooth to write on, but outrageously expensive. Using silk for everyday writing would be like printing spreadsheets on designer fabric, completely impractical for large-scale use. Then there were more unconventional materials, turtle shells, animal bones, and stones, often used for inscriptions or divination rituals. These were fine for short messages or ceremonial purposes, but far from efficient for longer documents, especially in a rapidly growing and complex society. As China's bureaucracy expanded, with civil service exams, tax records, trade documentation, and literary pursuits becoming more central to daily life, there was an urgent need for a writing surface that was lightweight, inexpensive, portable, and easy to produce. The problem was clear. Civilization was evolving, and its tools for preserving and sharing knowledge had to evolve too. Something scalable was needed. That something turned out to be paper, and it would change the world. So, who actually invented paper? That honor goes to Kai Lun, a Chinese court official who lived during the Eastern Han Dynasty, around 105 CE. Working within the imperial court, Kai Lun recognized the growing need for a more practical writing material, and he delivered brilliantly. His innovation was both clever and resourceful. He used everyday materials like tree bark, hemp, old rags, and even discarded fishing nets. These were mashed into a pulp with water, then spread into thin layers, drained, pressed flat, and left to dry under the sun. The result? A smooth, lightweight, durable surface that could be easily written on, a revolutionary leap forward. Kai Lun presented this new material to the emperor, and the reaction was basically ancient China's version of a standing ovation. The court recognized its potential immediately. What's even more remarkable is that Kai Lun was officially credited for this invention in historical records, which was rare at the time. Most ancient innovations were either anonymous or attributed to collective knowledge. But in this case, his contribution was so significant that it couldn't be ignored. Thanks to Kai Lun, the age of paper began, and with it, the foundation for a global knowledge revolution. The secret traveled along the Silk Road, where ideas, technologies, and sometimes even people moved between empires. After the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, Chinese papermakers were captured by Arab forces, and with them, the knowledge of papermaking spread westward. From there, the technique reached Baghdad, then Spain, and eventually the rest of Europe, where it became a transformative force centuries after Kai Lun's original invention. By the time Europe embraced paper, it was treated as a revolutionary development, even though China had already been using it for hundreds of years. It was mass-producible, meaning it could be made relatively quickly and in large quantities, perfect for a growing empire with a thirst for administration, literature, and learning. It was also far cheaper than silk, which had previously been used for important documents but was too costly for everyday use. Compared to bamboo, which was heavy and cumbersome, paper was lightweight and portable, making it ideal for scrolls, books, and official records. Unlike stone, bone, or metal, paper offered a smooth, easily writtable surface that didn't require chisels or special tools, just ink and a brush. In a sense, paper was like the prototype of the printing press. It didn't just make writing easier, it made the spread of ideas possible on a much larger scale. It democratized access to information, allowing knowledge to move beyond elite scribes and emperors to scholars, merchants, and eventually entire populations. It was more than an invention. It was the infrastructure of literacy and culture, and it changed the trajectory of human communication forever. 2. Printing. Let's rewind to a time long before mass production, TikTok trends, or even bookstores.
This passage
In ancient China, knowledge was spreading fast, thanks to Confucian teachings, civil service exams, poetry, religious texts, and an ever-growing bureaucracy. But copying texts by hand, that was slow, expensive, and painfully prone to human error. So naturally, the question arose, how can we copy stuff faster? That's when woodblock printing entered the scene, around the Tang Dynasty, sometime in the 7th century. Here's how it worked. Artisans would carve out an entire page of text in reverse on a wooden block, ink it up, press paper onto it, and boom, you had a copy. Think of it like an ancient stamp machine, but with serious craftsmanship. It was first used for Buddhist texts. The earliest surviving example is the Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE, and quickly caught on. Suddenly, books weren't just rare treasures. They could be reproduced, shared, and stored. Knowledge could finally travel. But that was just the beginning. Fast forward to the 11th century during the Song Dynasty, and along comes a game changer named Bai Sheng. Instead of carving an entire page into one block, he had a brilliant idea. Create individual characters out of clay, arrange them to form any page, and then reuse them again and again. That's movable type, the blueprint for all modern printing. At the time, it didn't fully take off in China, mostly because the Chinese writing system had thousands of characters, compared to the 26 in the Latin alphabet, which made organizing movable type much more complex. Still, the innovation was centuries ahead of its time, and the concept laid the groundwork for future printing revolutions. Eventually, the concept of printing, along with countless other ideas, began to make its way west. Through trade routes like the Silk Road, through cultural exchanges, and the steady flow of travelers, scholars, and merchants, the seeds of printing technology slowly migrated across continents. But it took centuries for the West to truly grasp and develop the idea into something widespread. That moment finally came in the 15th century, when Johannes Gutenberg introduced his version of movable type printing in Europe. His press used metal letters, oil-based ink, and a mechanical press, which made it incredibly efficient for alphabetic languages like Latin. Gutenberg's press is rightfully celebrated for launching a printing revolution in the West. It made books cheaper, knowledge more accessible, and laid the foundation for everything from the Renaissance to modern education systems. The invention that gave the world mass communication, literacy, and publishing didn't begin in a German workshop. It began with Chinese artisans, clay characters, and a bold reimagining of how knowledge could move. So next time you pick up a printed book, scan a menu, or even read a flyer on the street, take a moment to thank Bi Sheng, those early woodblock pioneers, and the quiet genius of ancient China that shaped how we read the world today. 3. Gunpowder. It all started in the 9th century China, with Taoist alchemists on a spiritual quest, not to build weapons, but to discover the elixir of immortality. That's right, they were trying to cheat death, and instead, they ended up creating something that would one day fuel cannons, rockets, and revolutions. The earliest recipes for gunpowder combined saltpeter potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur. The alchemists quickly realized it didn't grant eternal life, but it did explode. They called it fire medicine, and even though it wasn't what they were looking for, it turned out to be far too powerful to ignore. By the 10th century, the Chinese military had already started experimenting with gunpowder in warfare, using it in fire arrows, grenades, flamethrowers, and eventually the first gunpowder-based rockets. These were not just prototypes, they were actively used in battles to great effect. China even developed fire lances, early forms of gun barrel weapons that evolved into true firearms. In short, the Chinese didn't just invent gunpowder, they invented gunpowder warfare. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, the knowledge of gunpowder began its slow but steady journey westward from China to the Islamic world. And this didn't happen overnight. It was likely the result of a mix of trade, conflict, and cultural exchange. First, there were the Silk Road trade routes, where merchants weren't just exchanging silk and spices. They were also sharing ideas, technologies, and even military secrets. Then there were the military encounters across Central Asia, where armies collided and technologies were often adopted out of necessity. But perhaps the biggest accelerant in this process was the Mongol Empire. When the Mongols conquered China in the 13th century, they came into direct contact with Chinese gunpowder weapons, rockets, fire lances, grenades, and they used them. As the Mongols expanded their empire westward into Persia, the Middle East, and parts of Eastern Europe, they brought those technologies with them. It wasn't long before Islamic scholars and engineers began studying and adapting gunpowder. By the 13th century, Arabic texts on gunpowder chemistry started to appear, reflecting a growing understanding of its potential, not just as a mystical substance, but as a military game changer. This phase was crucial because it laid the groundwork for the technology's eventual arrival in Europe. Gunpowder finally reached Europe in the 13th century, and, interestingly, it arrived not with a bang, but through books. The earliest references in Europe pop up in the mid-1200s, And they weren't found on battlefields just yet. They were in the writings of curious scholars. One of the first to mention it was Roger Bacon, an English philosopher and early science nerd who described the ingredients and explosive effects of gunpowder in a text around 1267. He probably didn't get that knowledge directly from Chinese scrolls, but more likely from Arabic sources, passed down through translation and word of mouth. Around the same time, Albertus Magnus, a German scholar and theologian, and Marcus Graecus, an author of a widely circulated Latin text on fire and explosives, also wrote about explosive mixtures. These early descriptions tell us something fascinating. Europe learned about gunpowder through knowledge first, not technology. It came as a chemical curiosity, something exotic and strange, shared via Spain, Sicily, or perhaps even through contact during the Crusades, where Europeans and Muslims frequently exchanged more than just sword blows. But that curiosity didn't stay theoretical for long. By the early 1300s, European armies and engineers began experimenting with gunpowder weapons. The first versions were crude, giant, clunky bombards that looked like oversized metal tubes and handheld fire lances, basically spears with mini fire blasters on the end. It wasn't elegant, but it was deadly, and people took notice. One of the earliest recorded battlefield uses of gunpowder artillery came during the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where English forces reportedly used early cannons against the French. While it didn't win the war single-handedly, it made an impression and kicked off a whole new era of warfare in Europe. So, in just a few decades, gunpowder in Europe went from scholarly curiosity to the future of war.
What is this
Europe gets more credit for weaponizing gunpowder effectively, but the formula, purely Chinese. 4. Compass. Before satellites and GPS apps told us where to go, people had to rely on the sun, stars, or just kind of guess. But around the 11th century, Chinese scientists changed the game with something deceptively simple: a magnetic compass. The earliest versions actually go back even further to the Han Dynasty, but they weren't used for travel at first. Believe it or not, the first compasses were used for feng shui, helping people orient buildings and graves in harmony with natural forces. Spiritual vibes first, sailing second. By the Song Dynasty, Chinese navigators began using magnetized needles floating in water or mounted on plates to determine direction at sea. This was huge. For the first time, you didn't need the stars to travel. You could find true north even on cloudy days or during long ocean voyages. It was like flipping a light switch on in the age of exploration. Centuries before the age of exploration actually happened. By the time we reach the late 12th or early 13th century, something interesting starts to happen. European sailors begin using compasses, specifically a version called the dry compass. But let's rewind for a second. How did this Chinese innovation make it all the way to Europe? As with many inventions of the ancient world, the Silk Road and surrounding trade networks played a big role. Arab merchants and navigators who had contact with Chinese innovations through both trade and Islamic scholarship acted as cultural bridges. The Islamic Golden Age was a period of intense learning and translation, and many Chinese scientific ideas, including those related to astronomy, magnetism, and navigation, were studied and documented. From there, knowledge slowly trickled westward, often through Spain, Sicily, or the Crusader states, where Christian Europe encountered Islamic science up close. By the late 1100s, references to compasses start appearing in European texts. One of the earliest mentions comes from Alexander Neckham, an English scholar who, in circa 1190, described the use of a magnetized needle for navigation. At first, the device was similar to the Chinese version, a needle floating in a bowl of water. But European engineers soon modified the design, mounting the needle on a pivot or pin inside a protective casing. This was the dry compass, better suited for the rough conditions of ocean travel. This tiny tweak had massive consequences. Suddenly, European sailors could navigate more confidently across the Mediterranean, even in bad weather or without visible stars. And just a century or two later, they began to push into the Atlantic, sparking what we now call the Age of Exploration. Names like Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, and Christopher Columbus became symbols of Western adventure and global discovery. But here's the irony. None of those journeys would have been possible without the compass, an invention that came from China. So while Europe often gets the spotlight for discovering the world, the truth is more layered. The tools they used to navigate the unknown, from the compass to nautical maps, were part of a global chain of innovation that started in the East. The nameless Chinese inventors who first figured out how to harness a magnetic field may not be in the history books, but they were absolutely steering the ships. 5. Seismograph. The seismograph is one of those inventions that feels modern, but China was already building earthquake detectors when Rome was still flexing its aqueducts. Long before modern science could track tectonic plates or send alerts to your phone, ancient China had already figured out how to detect earthquakes and measure where they came from. Yep, we're talking about a working seismograph built nearly 2,000 years ago. The inventor? Zhang Heng, a brilliant astronomer, mathematician and engineer of the Han Dynasty, lived in 132 CE. He wasn't just your average scholar. He was what you'd call a true polymath. Zhang noticed a recurring problem. Earthquakes would happen in far-off regions of the empire, and the central government wouldn't find out until days or weeks later. In a country as vast as China, that was a serious issue, especially when it came to disaster response and protecting citizens. So, he set out to build a machine that could sense distant tremors, and what he came up with was nothing short of genius. Zhang's invention looked like a large bronze urn, decorated with 8 dragon heads, each facing a different cardinal direction. Beneath each dragon was a frog, mouth open, ready to catch a ball. Inside the urn was a suspended pendulum mechanism, and when the ground shook, even slightly, the inner pendulum would shift, triggering one of the dragons to drop a bronze ball into the mouth of the frog directly below it. That falling ball wasn't just for show. It indicated the direction the quake came from. And here's the wild part. This wasn't theoretical. Historical records say the device once dropped a ball even though no tremor was felt in the capital. Days later, news arrived that an earthquake had struck hundreds of kilometers away in the direction the machine had indicated. Zhang Heng had built a fully mechanical, directional earthquake detector in the 2nd century. The Western development of the seismograph came much later than China's, and it followed a very different path. While Zhang Heng's seismograph was a brilliant ancient invention, it was largely unknown outside China for centuries. For a long time in medieval and early modern Europe, earthquakes were seen less as natural phenomena and more as acts of God. There was little understanding of geology or seismic activity, and no serious effort to detect or measure quakes scientifically. That began to change slowly in the 18th century, especially after one major disaster, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. That quake was catastrophic. It destroyed much of the city, killed tens of thousands, and sent shockwaves both literal and philosophical across Europe. It got Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Kant debating natural disasters not as divine punishment, but as phenomena that could be understood through science. But still, Europe had no instrument to measure earthquakes. The earliest seismograph-like instruments in the West didn't appear until the 19th century. One of the key names here is Luigi Palmieri, an Italian physicist. In the 1850s, he developed the first electromagnetic seismograph, a device that used metal levers and mercury to detect small movements of the Earth. His machine could record the timing and intensity of tremors, which was a major leap forward. Then came John Milne, an English geologist often called the father of modern seismology. Working in Japan in the late 1800s, Milne designed a more advanced, horizontal pendulum seismograph that could record ground motion on a rotating drum. His work laid the foundation for the global seismographic network we use today. By this time, Western science had fully embraced seismology as a serious discipline. Universities began studying earthquakes, observatories started installing instruments, and governments became interested in earthquake forecasting and structural safety. What's especially ironic is that Zhang Heng's seismograph remained a hidden gem of ancient technology. His original design was lost over time, and it wasn't widely studied or understood until Chinese scholars reconstructed it in the 20th century, using historical descriptions. So while the West was inventing entirely new earthquake sensors, China had already built something similar nearly 1,700 years earlier. They just didn't know it. 6. Mechanical clocks. Mechanical clocks are another hidden gem in the history of invention. And guess what? China was ticking ahead of the curve, literally. Most people think of medieval Europe when they hear mechanical clock, but the earliest complex clockwork machines were all in China. Before the modern clock tower became a symbol of precision and progress, timekeeping was a very different story. In the ancient world, people mostly relied on sundials, water clocks, incense timers, and other clever but limited methods. That worked fine until societies became more complex and needed accurate, consistent ways to measure time, especially for rituals, calendars, governance, and astronomy. That's where ancient China stepped in and once again blew past expectations. The credit goes to Su Song, a Chinese polymath during the Song Dynasty, who, in 1092 CE, created what many historians consider the world's first fully mechanical, water-driven, astronomical clock tower. And this wasn't just a glorified cuckoo clock, it was a marvel of engineering. Su Song's clock was a true masterpiece of engineering, centuries ahead of its time. It featured a water-powered escapement mechanism, the same fundamental gear system found in modern mechanical clocks, along with a chain drive transmission to regulate movement. At the top of the structure sat a rotating celestial sphere, designed to model the stars and planets with stunning precision. Perhaps most fascinating were the multiple levels of automata, mechanical figures that rang bells, struck gongs, and marked the passing hours like a perfectly choreographed dance. The entire device was housed in a massive wooden tower over 30 feet tall, and it wasn't just for show, it was accurate to the second, built more than 900 years ago. While Susong's astronomical clock was ticking away in 11th century China, Europe was still marking time with sundials, water clocks, and church bells rung by hand. It wasn't until the 14th century that mechanical clockmaking finally emerged in Europe, over 250 years later, ushering in a whole new way of experiencing time. One of the earliest known examples of a true mechanical clock in the West is the Salisbury Cathedral clock in England, built around 1386. Unlike Susong's sophisticated astronomical tower, the Salisbury clock was much simpler in design. It ran on weights, gears, and a verge and foliot escapement, the earliest known mechanical time-regulating system in Europe. It didn't have a dial or hands, it simply rang a bell at regular intervals to signal the hour. The clock is believed to have been built by 3 craftsmen: Henry de Vic, a French clockmaker who was active around the same time; Richard of Wallingford, an English abbot and mathematician; and a lesser-known figure, Peter Lightfoot, a monk who constructed clocks in monasteries across England. In medieval Europe, monasteries and cathedrals were central to daily life, not just spiritually, but practically. The monastic schedule revolved around strict prayer times, which had to be followed precisely. So, there was a growing need for accurate self-operating timekeepers, and that's where mechanical clocks came in. They weren't just practical tools. Clocks were seen as symbols of order, divine rhythm, and human ingenuity. But compared to Susong's astronomical masterpiece, the Salisbury clock and its European contemporaries were still relatively basic. They lacked moving models of the heavens, calendar functions, or any of the planetary precision the Chinese clock had. Susong's clock was ahead of its time. It wasn't just about telling time, it was about syncing heaven and earth. Chinese scholars believed in cosmic harmony, and accurate timekeeping helped align human activity with celestial patterns. The use of the escapement mechanism is especially important. This is the part that regulates the release of energy and controls how fast the gears move. It's considered the heart of mechanical clocks, and China had it long before Europe. Unfortunately, when the Jurchen invaded the capital Kaifeng in the early 12th century, the clock was dismantled and never successfully rebuilt. Over time, the knowledge faded, and the West ended up reinventing mechanical clockmaking centuries later, largely unaware that China had already done it, and arguably done it better. While the West eventually picked up the torch, sometimes refined the tech, sometimes ran with it, and sometimes took the credit, the spark for so much of what we now call modern civilization was lit in ancient China. And yet, history books haven't always been eager to tell that part of the story. But here's the thing, this isn't about East versus West. It's about recognizing that innovation is a global relay. Ideas travel, civilizations borrow, but the truth deserves a spotlight. So the next time someone says, well, Europe invented, you can smile and say, actually, they caught up. If you made it this far, thank you. Like, drop a comment, which invention blew your mind? And keep an eye out for our next video. Until then, stay curious and stay sharp. History's deeper than you think.